continued growing insecurity of Russia. Take us just in a quick moment how that led to the breakout of the Ukraine war, and then I want to ask you a question about European views about all of this.
Yeah, well, let me just say first, I don't dismiss the idea that many in Washington perhaps had the good intentions, because under the idea of liberal hegemony, the assumption was if there's one center of power, it will mitigate the international anarchy. There will be no great power rivalry if no country can even have the aspirations to rival the United States. Also, with the dominance of the US as the new Pax Romana, they can elevate the role of liberal democratic values in the system. So many people probably believed in this, but as we know, over time, the old values become corrupted when they're only in service of building this dominance. And this is what we also saw in Ukraine, because many of the countries in Europe, from the Baltic states to Poland, they obviously had good historical reasons to fear Russia. So if they were given the option of having a common Europe, or only removing the dividing lines of Europe, or instead moving the dividing lines to eastwards, so they end up on the right side of this bloc politics, they favor the bloc politics. So I don't dismiss this. But Ukraine was different. Between 91 and 2014, every poll, doesn't matter who did the poll, every poll showed that barely 20% of Ukrainians would want to join NATO. NATO owns documents even suggested this was a great problem. What can we do? How can we improve our relationship with Ukraine when the people don't want it, when their own legal system opposes it? So this was a huge problem for NATO if you want to expand. And not only did we know that Ukrainians did not want to be a part of NATO, but as we learned from many people, from Merkel, from the various European ambassadors, they all said the same thing, that if we try to bring this reluctant Ukraine into NATO, we're going to have civil war and likely a Russian invasion. Even the CIA director of the United States, William Burns, he wrote this in 2008 when we began to roll the ball by pushing for when we promised Ukraine future NATO membership. He argued,
he at the time was U.S. ambassador to Russia. So now he's the CIA director. At the time, he was right there in Moscow as the U.S. ambassador, and he sent home a memo. This is very dangerous.
Yeah, not only would Russia invade, but at the end he adds, this is a decision Russia does not want to make. And this kind of goes strictly against our argument about a non-provoked Russian invasion, because if it's, how can you say it's not provoked if Burns himself recognizes Russia would have to invade, even though it doesn't want to do so. It's responding to NATO. Even the former British ambassador to Moscow, I forgot his name, Roderick Lyne. Yeah, he also argued the same, that in 2020, if we want to start a war with Russia, he said, this is the best way to do it. Pull in a Ukraine which never wanted to be a part of NATO to begin with. It was very predictable, but again, our narrative has become completely immune to facts.
So let me ask you, we're in the middle of this war that you and I see, and I have seen a lot of it close up, came from the U.S. relentlessly pressuring Russia, and not only in what we've talked about, but also new missile systems put in, U.S. leaving the anti-ballistic missile treaty, U.S. leaving the intermediate nuclear force treaty, and so forth. The U.S. participating in the overthrow of a neutral government in Ukraine, after all, in 2014. Now, the European leaders seem to know all of this was provocative and dangerous all along. I remember speaking to Norwegian leaders during this period. They were very much upset with George W. Bush for pushing NATO membership. We know that Mrs. Merkel, Chancellor Merkel, was warning the United States, don't provoke a new division in Europe. So the risks were known to Europe. The worst cases emerged. But now we don't hear this debate in Europe, other than by brilliant analysts like you. But we don't hear it from the political leaders of Europe. Almost none. There are a couple. Viktor Orban in Hungary and Fico in Slovakia, but very, very few. So why is Europe so much on the narrative right now?
I'm not sure how they ended up so extreme, but you are right. In 2008, not only did the Europeans resist it, in Angela Merkel's own words, if we offer a NATO membership to Ukraine, the Russians will interpret it as a declaration of war. But even within the American camp, you had people like Condoleezza Rice and even Secretary of Defense Robert Gates, who also recognized this was not a good idea. But again, Bush, he pushed for it, and the Europeans, they knew it was dangerous, but they accepted it anyways. And they allowed themselves to pressure by Washington, and then gradually, of course, you have then the conflicts beginning, and even by 2014, the instinct of the Europeans, the Germans and the French, at least, was to negotiate an end to this. When war predictably broke out, as everyone had predicted, they negotiated this Minsk agreement and to get an end to this. So give some autonomy to Donbass, which could also prevent NATO expansion. So we could have a peaceful settlement. And they negotiated this. Everyone in the whole United Nations confirmed, yes, this is the only path to peace. Every meeting we have, we keep saying this is the only path to peace. And later on, we learned that the Europeans, even themselves, only saw this as an opportunity to rearm Ukraine. And if you forward all the way to now to see what's happened in Europe, now we have the new incoming foreign, so it's a foreign policy chief of the EU, Kaja Kallas, who calls for breaking up Russia in small pieces. She doesn't want diplomacy with Russia because they are war criminals. And it's when people like Orban travels to Ukraine and Russia and China to try to start some diplomacy, they call him a Russian puppet and try to punish him for trying diplomacy. So it's quite extraordinary to sit there in Europe. And, I watched the EU for years and years, always have the same solution to any conflict around the world, which is at least sit down and start to talk. And now we have 2.5 years where we criminalize diplomacy. You're not allowed to talk to the adversary. And as my former Prime Minister and now former NATO Secretary General Jens Stoltenberg argues, weapons are the path to peace, while diplomacy is appeasement. So we completely lost our minds, and no one even defines what it means to defeat the world's largest nuclear power, who considers this to be an existential threat. So it's a complete madness, and it's very frustrating because all the evidence is there, but no one is allowed to reference it unless they want to be accused of, carrying water for Putin or this kind of rhetoric.
And you point out, well, this is not sitting still.